Bruce Rushton shakes up Springfield and shakes up his staff. We'll talk about it next on CapitolView. Welcome to CapitolView, the weekly program about Illinois state government, politics, and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on CapitolView is David Dahl, reporter for WTAX Radio. Welcome, Dave.
Hello.
And also Andrew Maloney, reporter for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome, Andrew.
Good to be back, Bruce.
That is some combination you have, Bruce. I think you've outdone yourself.
How so?
Just look at you. I mean, just look. And I would know.
Well, I got to say, I admire the black cashmere jacket here in the midst of a heat emergency.
It's a mental exercise.
Anywho, talking about heat, let's talk about, get right into it here. What's going on with the governor's office lately? It's been in the news quite a bit. Governor Bruce Rushton, in the wake of losing the budget battle, or at least how it's been cast, he's lost the budget battle, has shaken up his staff in a big way. Dave, can you describe for our viewers who might not be attuned to this, just what's been happening in the governor's office recently?
It seems to be the kind of situation where you keep showing up to work and look around and see who's still working there. And whether you want to say it's timing has something to do with it, right after the vetoes were overridden after the 4th of July or not, that is what happened with the chief of staff leaving and a number of other top people leaving for various reasons, or being fired, or being asked to resign, or deciding on their own to resign. The chief of staff is now Christina Rasmussen, who's been president of the Illinois Policy Institute. A number of other folks on board now who are in, and we're talking about the inner circle, the Council of Chiefs, people who were not elected, people who Governor Rushton is selecting to be the people he listens to really make things go. A number of other folks are coming over from the Illinois Policy Institute. And so some are saying it would portend that the rest of Governor Rushton's term could be a little more ideologically to the right than the first 2+ years have been.
Well, let's talk about the Policy Institute for a second. They are not the ACLU, far from it. They're diametrically opposed to some degree. Andrew, I mean, give us a brief rundown on the Policy Institute and what their reputation might be.
Well, it's hard to think about them without thinking about how staunchly opposed they were to this tax increase. Sure. Of course, the governor said that he didn't want a permanent tax increase. He blamed the Speaker of the House, Democrat from Chicago, Mike Madigan, and he tried to veto that tax increase, even though at some points he said, you know, we'll need an increase in revenue, but this isn't how we want to do it. The Illinois Policy Institute never really bought into the idea of needing a tax increase.
In fact, they put out their own budget that said, "Hey, we can balance. We can make these books balance without a tax increase."
Right. We can balance it by making cuts. There's plenty of ways to cut, and I think they've also been kind of just that general philosophy of pro-business reforms. We need to make the state viable, and we need to do it sort of by decreasing how much we value labor unions, for instance. We need to do things like workers' compensation. So that part, definitely they've been where the governor was prior to this shakeup. But the tax increase to me is really what sticks out. And they've been a big presence in Springfield. Like you said, they put out their own budget. They've got a legal arm, basically, a group of lawyers who—
A journalistic arm?
A journalistic arm.
Journalistic arm.
Very, very active. And I think they've only increased their presence really in a number of ways in Springfield over the last few years.
A person who wrote an op-ed suggesting that the state fire all its employees is now the director of communications for the governor, Diana Rickert.
Yeah. So can you hear me now? It's well, I mean, let's talk about also who are these guys really? Because one of the knocks or one of the criticisms of the Policy Institute is the sources of its money have never been clear, and so now they have, in fact, apparently a large influence or in a position to influence the governor's office, and yet we don't really know, or do we know, who really is behind the Policy Institute? Who's really been paying the bills for this outfit over the years? Do we know?
Well, the governor has been a donor.
Has been a donor.
Not currently.
Not currently. So who's been funding these guys? And clearly they have a right, a right conservative view of government, what are the odds that they can actually transfer? I mean, it's easy to some extent to stand on the sidelines and say, oh, well, here's how you should write the budget, and here's how you should reform the criminal justice system or any other aspect of government. How likely is it that they're going to be able to translate their criticisms into real action within government circles?
I think in some ways you're kind of seeing that on the national level with a party, with the Republicans, who were out of power for a long time and just basically saying, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this. When you get into power, when you gain power, it seems like it's much more complicated to actually be the ones responsible for the governing, the ones who are putting the proposals out there on the table and being willing to take the heat for them. Of course, they know how to take criticism. We've been talking about them for a lot. They know how to suggest things, but in terms of actually moving the ball down the field, you're right. It seems like it would be hard to get anyone really in a Democrat-controlled legislature to buy into what they're saying. So I think just as a general principle, governing is always much harder, and especially when you get close to an election.
Another person,
in 2018.
Another person who's moved on has been the brains of the campaign operation, and Mike Z. And governor has replaced him with someone from the Illinois Opportunity Project, which is also a for lack of a better term, a dark money organization, which brings me to the point that how does the governor think this is a path to getting reelected? How will he convince a majority of Illinois voters that they should give him another 4 years? I guess we'll find out in the next year plus.
Has he, in effect, then just slammed the door on working with the legislature for at least the remainder of his first term? I mean, is this some sort of repudiation of, this hasn't been working, we're going to go a different direction? I mean, if you're in the legislature, how are you taking this kind of a staff shakeup? Well,
we saw actually some pretty tangible evidence of kind of the repercussions. As you said, the governor was forced to, he vetoed the tax hike. The tax hike's still going into effect. The budget's still going into effect. We've got another battle over school funding that we're going to touch on probably. But, after the legislature overrode his veto, we saw a handful of Republicans defect. And one of them in particular comes to mind, Representative Steve Anderson, a Republican from Geneva. I think shaking hands with Speaker Madigan after that vote, and lo and behold, not too long after, he's out of his position as a floor leader, right? So there's a very explicit display of, if you go against us, it might not be the best situation for you, at least in terms of maintaining that leadership level.
I think it makes you ask, too, what does it mean to be a Republican? And I think the election of President Trump makes you ask the same question, too. It seems like the farther to the right, the more extreme, the better, according to some. And if you're someone like Steve Anderson, or, I think back to Ray LaHood, could Ray LaHood get elected today?
Well, it's curious because, you had the governor actually at some point saying, okay, I can live with a tax increase if we some structural reforms, but that's not off the table. And so he was at least within the last 2 months has been saying, okay, a tax rate increase might be okay, which led to some negative coverage, I think, of the Wall Street Journal. He was accused of capitulating and that sort of thing. And now he's hired these folks from the Policy Institute, who were amongst the biggest critics of a tax increase. And he previously had said, well, a tax increase isn't necessarily a bad thing if we get other things in return. It's almost like a whipsaw to some degree. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, we do have the tax increase, and we've gotten nothing in return. None of the governor's initiatives have really gone forward. He did veto the bill, and I wonder why he vetoed the budget immediately, right in time for the override, et cetera, when he could have just sat on it, as he's accusing the legislature of sitting on Senate Bill 1.
So he could make the case then that he has been consistent here, that he hasn't been waffling and going back and forth on a tax increase.
Well, he was pretty clear that he didn't like the budget bills as they were, and he's clear that he doesn't like Senate Bill 1 as amended, and so his point this week has been send me Senate Bill 1, the school funding bill, so I can mandatorily veto it.
Right.
And if we get to the point where you're talking about playing chicken, is Senate Bill 1 as is better than nothing?
Well,
Or are we going to have nothing and go into the fall with schools not getting their state money?
So is Senate Bill, are you suggesting then that is it the choices between Senate Bill 1 or having schools open?
It could be. And that could be why the Senate's sitting on it.
Okay. Let me go back just for a second to the staff shakeup, if we could. I mean, the first week here, the first few days were a couple of speed bumps here. We had the quote-unquote body man, the person who is with the governor on a day-to-day basis, be dismissed on his first day in the job after insensitive remarks on his Twitter account came to light. Homophobic references. I think at one point he said, maybe referencing what happened in Montana, maybe the way to win elections in Illinois is to beat up reporters, which of course we don't like that idea, on this forum at least.
That wasn't even the worst thing he tweeted.
Yeah.
But I think what's astounding about that whole story is that stuff is out there on social media and it's easy to check.
Sure.
And the narrative now is that the governor's staff is being hired at such a rapid pace that they're not doing these checks.
They're not vetting.
They're not saying, well, what did Andrew post when he was in college or whatever? Oh, what? He wrote that? Oh, we can't have that. That would have saved them some embarrassment, but on the other hand, how many votes is it going to cost them? And what's the capacity for embarrassment, really?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. I think that's a great point. You mentioned that speed bump. There was a communication specialist, right, who wrote some things about abortion and kind of comparing it to
Holocaust.
Nazi Germany, the Holocaust.
Yeah. Just in general, it's not a good idea to ever talk about the Holocaust or Nazis or Hitler if you're going to be. I mean, it often doesn't turn up well.
That is a good rule of thumb, at least.
Good rule of thumb.
But yeah, I do wonder because there was this disparity in kind of how the governor's office treated those two situations, right? The body man, as you said.
You're gone instantly.
It said, yeah, these are unacceptable. We fired as soon as we heard about this. With this post, they've said, well, those are her personal opinions. They're not the administration's positions on this issue. I believe it was a Sun-Times report talking about this.
And to be clear, she was comparing abortion to eugenics as practiced in Nazi Germany.
Correct. But said, just write, make sure you quote the full context, basically. And so there was that disparity in how they responded to those two situations. But I do wonder, I think that's a good point too, is how, in the news cycles of today, right, how much does that type of thing, how much do these hirings and sort of like a quick firing in one case and sort of maybe a more protracted discussion about what's appropriate in terms of one of these posts, how much do they play to an audience? And I mean, we've got a president who's pretty explicit on his Twitter account, to say the least.
Who's got a 36% approval rating. But
right, true. But there is still kind of in some corners at least, people who say, I don't really care what he says, as long as he does X, Y, and Z, he's going to be fine with me. So, and
to be fair, I mean, let's the case, these two folks we're talking about are relatively low-level staffers. I mean, the body person is there. I'm not even quite sure why he's there. He's there to keep tabs and to make introductions and help manage the event to some extent. This Brittany Carl, a $45,000 a year communications person. I mean, it's not like we're talking about the chief of staff making these remarks, but on the other hand, I think about the support that Rauner got during the last time around in the collar counties, the suburban women, those sorts of things. He got some support from folks who support abortion rights, and how if this is allowed, if this person is allowed to continue, could this come back and haunt him in any meaningful form during the election cycle, when of course the opposition would be prone to bring stuff like this up.
You say low level, the press secretary, people on that staff are awfully close to the spotlight. And the body man, I mean, that's someone who who just may follow the governor into the men's room. I mean, it's possible.
And would be on camera, you're correct. Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. And so to minimize that, I don't necessarily agree with, but I think what it speaks to is they are either so hasty and or careless in trying to replace people that they don't even run their names through the Google and see what kind of stuff comes back. I mean, either that or just hire people with Google-proof names like Jim Smith or John Jones or something like that.
Yeah.
But someone who's tweeted racist and homophobic things, I mean, it's not cool. And the other stuff about the Holocaust and abortion, you would hope that you'd at least think on that for a moment before you.
Is this a headache I can
decision.
put? Is this a headache I need, or is something that I can avoid? I mean, we should also perhaps mention that the governor was criticized in some circles for not immediately going to review flood damage up in Lake County, and that might perhaps have been interpreted as some sort of confusion or disarray, or caught up in events of there's so much going on in the governor's office that they're failing to pay attention to crossing the T's and dotting the I's.
And then Mike Snead of the Sun-Times makes it look as if the First Lady has a big say in this. Maybe she should, but she's certainly someone who has the governor's ear as well. And this is relatively new information.
How much margin of error does the governor have now, for the remainder of his term? I mean, he didn't prevail in the budget battle. Now we've got education funding, which we'll talk about in a second. How much longer can he go without being able to point to a real I've got some sort of crowning achievement here? He's done some things, to be clear, particularly on criminal justice. I think he deserves kudos on that. But by and large, for a lot of the things he set out to do in his turnaround agenda, he hasn't been overly successful. How much room for error does he have going forward?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have an exact answer, but I think with the staff and kind of just with the comments in public that he's made throughout both of the years that he's been in office, I think he's got a tune in his ear, right? And that tune is Speaker Madigan. I can blame Madigan, and that seems to resonate with quite a lot of people. So I think he's, going in on that strategy. I don't think he's shying away from the sort of the anger that people have toward what they consider entrenched government powers that be. And nobody in Illinois government really embodies that the way that Speaker Madigan does. And that's kind of the card that he's playing. So might his delay in getting up to Lake County to see the flood damage affect him in those crucial collar counties? It's very possible. Go ahead.
Thanks. If you're asking about his chances of being reelected, which I think is what it's all about,
absolutely,
probably, I mean, that's the true report card, most people aren't paying attention. But the way the governor presents himself, he makes it sound good. Speaker Madigan's bad, the Democrats are bad, your property taxes are too high, and some of his commercials gloss over the fact that he's been governor now for more than 2 years. And so he's had, while he will tell you the problems are decades in the making, he's had a chance. He's had a good chance, but the commercials don't really say, here's what I've accomplished. So far they've been more like, send me to Springfield and I'll change things for the better. He's got a lot of money, and the Democrats, if they're going to beat him, need to be organized. They need to get behind one candidate, and if it doesn't happen until the primary, so be it. But in my opinion, the last time I predicted something, I predicted they wouldn't have a budget. They need a message that's stronger than, well, I'm not Bruce Rauner.
It almost seems like he's written off, maybe to some extent, a large portion of the state here, that being the Cook County, Chicago, by going with this extreme, well, I won't call it extreme, but moving right on his staff shakeup and quadrupling down to some extent on the anti-Madigan themes. It seems like he's, in some way, has chosen this course, and for good or bad, he's going to stick with it.
Yeah, and I think it deserves mention, too, that we don't know what was going on exactly in those meetings between the Speaker, the House Democrats talking about what the Speaker famously called the non-budget items, right? But we know that coming out of the budget votes, the override votes, he at least made some mention that, well, we're going to keep working on the non-budget items, the workers' compensation reform and the property tax freeze, et cetera. But again, the explicit messaging, at least the way I'm kind of hearing it, is, like you said, doubling down on the anti-Madigan. So I do think it's fair to interpret this as this is his strategy. Anti-Madigan. I'm not banking on getting workers' compensation. I'm not banking on being able to work with the legislature.
Well, the next looming thing, obviously, is school funding, and we're coming up the Senate Bill 1, which would overhaul the way that state money is divvied out for education, is being held up. It's been passed by both houses, but it's not gone to the governor. The governor says he wants to change it because he sees it as a bailout for Chicago public schools. It's written in such a way, the budget, that it has to be, before education money can be distributed, it has to be distributed on something called an evidence-based formula, which is contained in this bill that the legislature is holding back and not giving to the governor, who says he would change it. How big of a chapter is this in terms of Rauner's governorship? Any sense of this?
Well, probably pretty big. He's laid down a pretty big marker that he's not going to give undue help to Chicago, yet he also says the schools are going to open on time. So I'm not sure how he and the Senate and House are going to work that out. It'll be another fascinating story to see.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's a great point. These are kind of hot button issues in one bill, the Chicago bailout, as it's called, and his promise to increase school funding, basically. It'll be fascinating because that's part of the reason that we originally thought, or maybe some of us thought, that a budget impasse like the one we saw for 2.5 years couldn't happen. I mean, of course, the governor signed school funding into effect for those 2 years, so the schools still opened. But not having the schools open was seen as a big pressure point that could compel people to come together for a budget.
If you're a House Republican, what do you do with this? I mean, there were a dozen or so that went against Rauner on the budget bill. Do you dare do it again on education funding?
That is a great question. It seems that if you were going to argue that it was the pressure of everything bad that was happening with not having a budget that led to these House Republicans sort of jumping ship, right?
Right. The reason du jour was our bond, our rating, our credit rating.
Right. The Moody's report, the credit rating, everything else sort of being on fire. David Harris coming in, a Republican, saying, I didn't get elected to preside over, the financial destruction of the state of Illinois. Then you would imagine that if we get to a point where a good number of schools aren't able to open, they're struggling, they're not getting any money, that would also have a lot of pressure. That would also put a lot of pressure on these same types of people.
Pressure from parents.
Pressure from parents is exactly a group of people that you don't want to double cross.
Sure. I mean, parents vote, especially if they remember that their kids didn't go to school because the state didn't come up with the money.
Yeah, it'd be a very visible, I think, sign of the impasse.
But who do you blame? I mean, don't both sides in some sense have plausible deniability here in terms of if the schools don't open, they can blame each. It wasn't my fault. It was Rauner's. It wasn't my fault. The governor says it was Mike Madigan's fault. I mean, how do those kinds of arguments?
Well, the governor continues to talk about Mike Madigan. There aren't many people that see the name Mike Madigan on the ballot. So nobody in this room is going to be voting for Mike Madigan, I can tell you that. Some of the people in this room will have a chance to vote for Bruce Rauner. So I think, and there are plenty of places in the state, including around here, that have Republicans in the legislature. So if you're voting for Sam McCann, Sarah Wojcicki, Bill Brady, Noreen Hammond, Tim Butler, you're doing what you can to stem Madigan and Cullerton, aren't you?
Well, in a sense, I mean, Sam McCann, he's talked about running for governor next year. He just got a fairly large contribution from labor, which has spurred some talk. Is there any?
Maybe that wasn't the best example, but he is a Republican.
Well, you have Sarah Wojcicki Jimenez, who votes against the governor on the budget. She hasn't been punished, so at least so far, visibly. It's early on, and she was the chief of staff for the first lady. Is Rauner really going to punish somebody like Sarah Wojcicki Jimenez?
I don't know if all 15 or 16 of them are going to be punished. And
Okay.
Ryder in the Senate, I mean, what's his comeuppance going to be? A graduate of Eastern Illinois University, the big employer in his district. He's going to say no to them, and then he's going to get punished for it. We'll see. I mean, anything can happen.
Okay, great. We've talked about politics a bit here. Let's talk just a little bit about the Democratic side. The money reports have just come in. Daniel Biss did fairly well. Pritzker's done fairly well and spent a lot of money. Chris Kennedy, not so hot. What's Kennedy not winning the money game? What's this about?
Right, and our colleague Rich Miller from Capital Facts described it, I think, aptly as one of the biggest surprises of the campaign season. You have a Kennedy legacy candidate, obviously plenty of name recognition. When he got in the race, a lot of us were speculating instantly, well, there's a guy that would have obviously the name recognition and the resources to do it.
And Barbara Streisand could only give him $1,000?
And and I think the number was
How far does a grand go? That's barely his plane ticket.
He's got less than $1 million on hand, I believe is the number. I think only raised something like $700,000. Bill Daley is his fundraising chief, and he said in a Cranes article, I believe, that I know the second quarter fundraising was bad, but he only needs 8 to 10 million. That'll get the message out there, and he'll be competitive.
Only 8 to 10 million.
It's only 8 to 10 million, right? Relative terms here.
Yeah. Well, pretty soon we'll start talking about real money, but it'll have to be next time because we're running out of time for this week on Capitol View. Thanks for joining us.